Hello, and welcome to the True Cost of Fraud for Lenders webinar, presented by LexisNexis Risk Solutions. Today's presentation will last approximately 45 minutes, followed by a 15-minute question and answer session. All participants will be in listen-only mode throughout the webinar and Q&A. Please use the chat function found on the left-hand side of your screen at any time to submit questions. Our moderator team will be keeping track of all questions, and our speakers will answer as many as time allows at the end of the session. A copy of today's slides and recordings will be sent to all attendees. I'd like to introduce today's speakers, Chris Ryman and Lucien DeVoe. Chris Ryman is a VP and Principal at KS&R. With over 20 years industry experience, Chris has a broad consulting background, guiding clients in the risk management and technology sectors with market opportunity analysis, fraud and financial crime assessment, customer needs exploration, and new products and service development. Skilled at both qualitative and quantitative research methods, Chris applies proven creative approaches to unlock the functional and emotional drivers of customer behaviors, such as ethnography, personification, and segmentation. Lucien DeVoe is a Director of Market Planning at LexisNexis Risk Solutions. He develops and drives the commercial market strategy for fintech, e-commerce, the sharing economy, and other digital native sectors. Lucien works with industry disruptors to facilitate economic inclusion and financial transparency by identifying opportunities that mitigate fraud, ensure financial crime compliance, and increase the ability to evaluate the credit risk of unconventional borrowers. I'll now turn it over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you to all of you who've joined us. We look forward to sharing key insights with you today. I'm Chris Ryman with KS&R. I'll lead us off, and I'm going to be accompanied by Lucien DeVoe from LexisNexis as we go throughout. Before we go through the study results, let's take a few minutes to talk about its objective, the scope of who we surveyed, the definitions that will be helpful to know as we're looking throughout the findings. At an overall perspective, the objective of the True Cost of Fraud for Lenders study is to call attention to the threats that lenders face from the rising risk of fraud, and also to point out ways that they can optimally protect themselves, especially as they grow. There's a fuller report beyond what we're going to show today with a lot of details that are available, and we're not going to have time to go through all of that. But what we will be able to talk about during our time today is taking a look at the cost of fraud and how that impacts the bottom line. We'll see who's getting hit harder by it. We'll talk about factors that are driving fraud, and we'll highlight ways to effectively fight it. We conducted a study, an online survey with 168 risk and fraud executives across a variety of lending institutions that you can see up at the upper right of your screens. When we spoke to these fraud executives, it was important that we used the same definitions to make sure we were all on the same page. So when we referred to fraud, we were talking about fraudulent transactions that are due to identity fraud, fraudulent requests for refunds, bounced checks, fraudulent requests for returns. We were also talking about external fraud, the consumer-facing fraud. This was not about insider fraud or employee fraud. We're also going to refer to some segments as we go throughout. When we talk about digital lenders throughout, what we mean are those lenders that earn 50% or more of their revenue through the online or the mobile channels. Small mid lenders are those that earn less than $50 million in annual revenues, and large lenders are those that earn $50 million or more in revenues. Another thing that we are going to talk about is the LexisNexis fraud multiplier. That really helps us understand what the true cost of fraud is. By its very name, it is a multiplier. And the reason that we talk about this is because the cost of fraud isn't just the lost value of a loan. It also includes indirect costs that are associated with fees or interest, or fees and interest lost on loans, and so forth. So for every $1 of fraud losses, in terms of the value of that lost loan, the actual cost is going to be higher. Let's take a look at some key trends that we're going to dive down a little bit more in detail throughout our discussion today. At an overall level, key findings are that the cost of fraud is higher for large digital lenders, those who are generating 50% or more of their revenues through the online or mobile channel, and they are earning $50 million or more in annual revenues. When I say the cost of fraud is higher for larger digital, this is what's helping to translate the actual difference between digital and non-digital lending firms, and we're going to take a look at that in a moment. The risk and concerns around fraud will likely increase as more lenders adopt mobile channels. And while we will call out the large digital lenders, the small and mid-digital lenders are also at risk. Lastly, our findings show that those lenders who can layer solutions by identity and fraud transaction solutions will actually experience fewer issues and less cost of fraud. So let's take a look at the first key finding, which is the cost of fraud is higher for large digital lenders. What we see here is the average reported number of monthly fraud transactions. The gray bars are those transactions that have been prevented. The green are those transactions that got through. Fraudsters were successful. If you take a look at the first two bar charts on the left, the digital firms versus the non-digital firms, what we see is that the volume of average reported monthly fraud really isn't all that different. The difference is really in the size of the lender, and particularly on the digital side. So the far right shows us that the larger digital lenders have significantly higher numbers of attempts per month. 1959 versus just under 500. It's nearly 5 times the amount of small digital lenders, and the amount of successful fraud attempts among the large digital lenders is nearly 4 times that amount. So why is that? Well, one reason is that there is a sizable use of the mobile channel among larger digital lenders. They're already, by definition of being digital, transacting in the online channel, but also adding the mobile channel makes them remote multi-channel providers. So that's more ways for fraudsters to attack them. And the mobile channel itself can be less secure depending on how it's used. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in some upcoming slides. So the volume is higher in terms of monthly fraud transactions among large digital. This trend continues when we look at the average dollar value of a monthly fraud transaction. On the far right, we see that the larger digital lenders are being targeted for higher loan amounts. On average, anywhere up to $3,500. And of course, there are some that are higher and some that are lower because that is an average. They tend to catch some of the higher loan values in terms of fraud. Those are in the gray bars. But it's not an insignificant value in the green bar for the large digital. The average value of a successful fraud attempt is about $750. And you add that up across all of these successful fraud attempts, and that becomes a pretty significant number for larger digital lenders. Therefore, it makes sense that the cost of fraud is higher for larger digital lenders than it is for others. On the far right, we see in the red dot, for every $1 of fraud for a large digital lender, it actually costs them $3.07. A higher LexisNexis fraud multiplier indicates that on top of the actual value of the fraud amount, the loss of the good, the loss of the loan, there's a higher indirect set of costs that are associated with fees and interest. And some of this could be related to the fact that the larger digital lenders have larger successful fraud values of loans. Now, it's important to point out that while I'm focusing on the larger digital, if you look at the fraud multiplier for the other segments, those are not insignificant numbers. They are still high, but it's just relatively higher when it comes to the large digital. But certainly when we look at the small mid-digital lenders, every $1 of fraud costs them $2.63. I think what we'll see as we go later on, this is going to relate in some part to less optimal tracking of fraud and or more limited use of fraud solutions by that segment. But with the large digital lenders, the higher cost of fraud is taking a bigger bite out of their revenues. This chart shows the percent that fraud costs are of revenues. And with large digital lenders, fraud costs are taking an average of 2.24% out of their bottom line revenues. By definition, the large digital with 50 million or more in revenues, you take 2.24% off of that, that's a sizable chunk of change for them. It's not insignificant for the other segments, but it is certainly much larger and a bigger hit among the large digital. Identity fraud is an issue across the board for digital lenders. And it's because of where they are playing. They're playing and transacting in an anonymous remote channel environment. And that, whether it's mobile or online, that's an easier environment for fraudsters to navigate, particularly with synthetic identities that involve a mix of real personal information from consumers mixed with fake personal information. Very, very hard to detect, very easy to stay under the radar. The larger digital, though, have an even bigger issue with identity fraud, because what you see here is the distribution of fraud losses by domestic versus international. And the larger digital can attribute over a quarter of their fraud losses to the international transactions. And so the issue with identity fraud is bigger for them because they've got broader exposure. And they've got broader exposure not just through the international, but again, remembering that they're heavily using the mobile channel. So there's that double dose of broader exposure, which is a nice segue to our second key finding, which is that the risk and the concerns of fraud that we've looked at really will likely increase as lenders adopt more of the mobile channel. What we see here is if we look on the far right, in the gray bars, here, this is the average percent, or this is the percent of digital lenders who said they are using m-commerce. Nearly all of the large digital firms are using the mobile channel. Just over half of the small digital are using the mobile channel. If we look at the left side, this is showing us the kinds of ways that transactions are taking place through a mobile browser, through a mobile app, through mobile contactless, text to pay, bill to mobile. And the large digital firms tend to be having transactions conducted through various applications and approaches. The smaller digital tend to have more of their transactions going through the web browser and fewer of them going through some of the other kinds of approaches. This actually can cause an issue for them as they grow their mobile channel business, because mobile browsing is not as secure as mobile apps. Customers also may tend not to download a provider's app unless they really expect that longer-term relationship. So they'll continue to use the mobile browser, which is less secure, and then that continues to open up risk. So this could be a challenge as long as that trend continues. When we turn to the perceptions around fraud, the cost and the risk of mobile fraud are concerns for most. But it's the larger digital, which, as we just saw, who have more experience in the mobile channel, they tend to be somewhat more sensitive to these two issues. They can speak from experience about the mobile channel and its challenges. And nearly half of the larger digital indicated that identity verification, while it's not shown in this chart, in our study findings, nearly half indicated that identity verification is a top challenge when operating within the mobile channel. So by definition, they are giving a heads up to those who will be adopting it or growing their use in the channel. These are, as I talked about challenges, we want to talk further about challenges, but we'd like to hear from you. And our moderator is going to walk us through a quick poll.
Great. Thanks, Chris. So as he mentioned, we do have our first poll. We'd love for everyone to weigh in. Our question is, what are your top 3 challenges related to the online channel? You may choose up to 3 answers. So is it around verification of identity, addresses, email, device? Perhaps it's delivery confirmation, account takeover prevention, international transactions, or order delay for verification, or other. Please let us know in the poll. And we'll give you guys a couple minutes while Lucian provides some additional insight.
Thanks, Amanda. And I'll kind of talk through as you guys fill in your top 3 challenges. But what I did want to provide is some broader perspective. We've been doing this study for 8 years now, and it actually started in retail. And for the first time, we've been able to segment out online lenders. And we've had some pretty important insights that we thought to share with you today. And as we focused on online lenders, it's actually important to note that of the different sectors, those being retail, e-commerce, brick and mortar financial services, online lenders actually have the highest cost of fraud. So whether that's looking at a percentage of revenue or considering the fraud multiplier that Chris went over, online lenders are actually finding that they are being hit the hardest. And so, as we look at the larger lenders and why they make such soft targets, it's really because they're operating at scale. And so we see an increase in bot attacks, for example, where applications can be replicated at very high volumes, allowing transactions to slip through at these larger lenders. And then I do want to emphasize that while the smaller lenders are not being hit at these greater volumes, they do have a harder time absorbing the losses. And so this can cause them to struggle to become profitable and actually prevent them from working at scale.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lucian. Well, we're going to go ahead and close our poll. So as you can see, identity verification is absolutely a clear concern or challenge, followed by address verification, and it looks like account takeover prevention and email verification are pretty close as well.
Thanks, Amanda. Looking at those findings there, that the identity verification being on top and the address verification being quickly right behind that, that really tracks with the findings in our surveys as being challenges for the online and the remote channel. I want to pick up on what Lucian had talked about. He mentioned that the small mid-digital lenders have a harder time absorbing fraud, and so we shouldn't forget them because they are also at risk. They do get hit with fraud. And some of that is that some of the approaches perhaps are not as optimal for fighting it. We look on this page, on this slide here, identity verification and confirmation delays are online challenges, not just for large, but also for the small vendors. You'll see that nearly 35% of the small mid lenders indicated that identity verification is among their top challenges online, along with delay in transaction confirmation and excessive manual orders, along with emergence of concerns about new transaction methods and specialized prevention for international transactions. Identity verification as an issue, though, does not occur in a vacuum, as you know. Whether it's online or it's through the mobile channel or it is on site, challenges with being able to identify someone really can generate further issues, really grows legs very quickly. It can slow down the onboarding process. It can provide delays in the transaction confirmation. It can require one to conduct manual reviews, which become very costly. And it can cause really overall friction with the consumer because of that slowdown. The other part here is it can cause false positives, and that can alienate customers, which then puts at risk current and also potential future revenue streams. So identity verification, confirmation delays with small lenders is a challenge, and there are additional kinds of issues that it generates, and we actually see this in our survey findings. The first set of pie charts on the left over here, those show the percent of transactions that are flagged by an automated system in the gray. So 66% of small mid-digital lenders, 66% for small mid-digital and 66% of flag transactions and 54% for large digital. What we see here is it's followed by the second column of pie charts, and that's the percent of those flag transactions that end up being sent for manual review. And 60% of those flag transactions among small digital lenders being sent for manual review. That's a lot of money. It's a lot of time and resources compared to just over a third for the large digital. As we move to the far right, what we're looking at is we see that 1/3 of the small mid and digital lenders in the 33% bubble end up of their decline transactions, those end up being false positives. So that's a fairly high percent of those transactions you've declined, and then they end up being false. They weren't an issue to begin with. Now, some of this relates to our findings that would suggest that small and mid digital lenders are less likely to track where prevented and successful fraud occurs, whether that is where it's occurring successfully or prevented through online or mobile channels, but also through different payment methods. So not keeping an eye on and tracking all those different spots that fraudsters can attack adds blind spots to being able to manage that. But that's not the only reason that could be influencing this. The other part is that the small and mid-digital lenders are also less likely to use risk mitigation solutions. We've seen that identity verification is a challenge for them. Yet in the middle section of this chart, you see it's very limited use of advanced identity authentication solutions. The other aspect there is that there's also limited use when it comes to advanced transaction fraud verification solutions. And there's really two aspects here. The identity verification is really meant to being able to let your customers in, to reduce the customer friction. The transaction fraud verification solutions are about keeping the bad guys out. So they're really limited in both of these. And as a result, they may not be optimizing the use of identity and transaction fraud solutions in a way that they can layer them to help to support identity verification and reduce manual reviews and false positives and fraud cost. And that is actually going to lead us to looking at our fourth finding, which is lenders who really are conducting that layering of solutions really do experience fewer issues and cost of fraud. Let's take a moment to set up what we're looking at. Let's look at the chart below, the layers of protection. We have three different groups of solutions. The first top row is what I would call the common core solutions that are used most often. Card verification, PIN and signature verification, browser malware, address verification. The second row are advanced identity solutions, such as device ID fingerprinting, geolocation, authentication by quizzes, or customer profiling database. Those are some of those kinds of solutions. And the third row are fraud transaction risk assessment solutions. It could be automated transaction scoring, or real-time transaction tracking, or rules-based filters, or 3D tools. If we look at the far left of this chart, lenders with a limited number of solutions, and they tend to be layering very limited. They mostly have the common core solutions. They have very few, if any, of the advanced identity or fraud transaction risk solutions. Our respondents in this group, we see that they have a very high percent of successful fraud attempts, 52 to 53%, and a high percent of those that are flagged that are sent for manual reviews. They also have, over 20% of their alerts are false positives. As we move more to the right, and let's look at those who are digital lenders, and they're also limited in what they are layering, minimal in terms of really any of these layers. They've got really up to 4 solutions. Again, it's a very similar set of percentages that we're seeing in terms of successful fraud attempts and the percent sent for manual review. But they tend to even have an even higher percent of false positives, which again shows the challenge of the anonymous online channel when it comes to really identifying and verifying whether that person is real and whether that transaction is on the up and up. The farther right we go, the more we begin to look at groups of respondents who are layering solutions. They may have 8 to 9 solutions. And it's not the number necessarily that matters. It's really the layering of it. They're layering the common core, and on top of the common core, they're layering advanced identity solutions, and they're layering fraud transaction risk assessment solutions. And we see that among this group of survey respondents, their percentages of successful fraud attempts and the percent of flagged transactions that are sent for manual review is much less. It's really, really bringing that. Those groups experience much less in terms of the volume and the resource allocation towards manual or fraud attempts. One would expect then that that's going to have an impact on the cost of fraud. And in fact, it does. Those who, again, are more limited in terms of their layering of solutions, the cost of every $1 of fraud cost, or every $1 of fraud loss, actually ends up costing them anywhere between $2.69 to $3.38. So there's a lot more cost that's involved there, and the percent that those fraud costs represent as taking out of the bottom line are also comparatively higher. As opposed to when we look at those who are layering, this group of our survey respondents had a lower fraud multiplier and a lower percent for which the fraud cost as a percent of revenues really hits the bottom line.
Okay, now we have our next opportunity to hear from you all. We want to know, is your organization looking to add any types of solutions to combat fraud? Device intelligence, quiz, KBA, secrets authentication, machine learning capabilities, government-issued ID validation, or biometric capabilities? I'll give you a minute or so to weigh in.
I don't know if any of you guys are data people like I am, but the drop-off in that curve was very interesting to me. And I think that it's really powerful to be able to visualize just how we can see this for both manual reviews and false positives. And that really shows that evidence that combining these different solutions are working well together. And I think, for those of you who need to justify the cost of some of these fraud expenses and fraud solutions, it's really an easy way to show just how you are able to reduce the fraud and the manual reviews when layering in multiple solutions.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and close our poll results now. It looks like we have a clear winner with the government-issued ID validation, followed by device intelligence and quiz, KBA, secrets authentication.
Great, Amanda. This is really interesting to see this mix in here, especially after the ID validation. There are use of other kinds of solutions here, so it's a good mix. So let's look at. We've talked about the findings. What does this mean? Well, lenders who are currently or they plan to allow online or mobile transactions should think about implementing solutions that are unique to different situations. So implement unique risk mitigation solutions for these remote channels. What I mean by that is that when we define someone as digital, we're defining them as a firm that conducts or that generates 50% or more of their revenues through online or mobile. So that means that it's not always someone who's just a company that is just conducting through online. Generally, what it means is that most of the digital lenders are conducting by different channels. They're using a combination of remote and in-person channels. And those have different kinds of risk, different kinds of challenges, much more in terms of one challenge in the online versus one in the remote. So there should be a strategy that looks to layer solutions for those unique channels and those risks. The lenders who adopt or expand their business through remote channels, their current solutions are used for in-person risk management. A lot of that was what we saw in the survey, and that's where some of their challenges come into play. They need to supplement or augment those with the solutions that are really going to help when it comes to the remote space. Lucian, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts I had was, when combining different solutions, I think it really takes a discerning mind to figure out what the right approach is for each channel. And I'll just throw out an example that I've seen in the past where people have taken a solution that's really built for a mobile phone, for example, that takes a picture of a government-issued ID, which was interestingly one of the things that are kind of challenging out there, and then taking that very same solution and applying it to a desktop environment. And firstly, that creates a difficult customer experience, given that they have to sort of hold their driver's license up to a webcam or their laptop camera, but also the resolutions on those cameras are not near to as good as some of the mobile phone cameras, and you actually see a lower success rate. So again, just being discerning and making sure you are thinking about each channel within their own merits, I think is going to be very important for both your fraud mitigation as well as your customer experience.
That's a great point, Lucian. Let's take a look at our second recommendation here. We talked a lot about the large lenders, but let's also think, when considering risk mitigation solutions across the board, lenders should seek a multi-layered approach to these different kinds of fraud. I think I had mentioned about it earlier. It's really critical to address both the identity and the transaction-related fraud. There's two different perspectives. The identity verification and authentication is really about the importance of letting your customers in with the least amount of friction and risk, the least amount of questions you have to put in front of them that may make them feel uncomfortable and may make you feel uncomfortable, the fewer amount of steps that you need to put them through their paces when they are coming in for onboarding or coming in to conduct transactions. So that's an important piece. The transaction-related fraud is really about keeping the bad guys out. Is this a fraudulent transaction? Of course, certainly that is part and parcel to the identity verification, because someone who is not who they say they are is fraud, but you really also need to have the transaction protection there. So as we saw, the layered approach really can reduce costs that are associated with the manual reviews of trying to verify and authenticate. And let me make a distinction here, because sometimes it's not always clearly distinguished. There really are two different elements. There is the verification, taking the data that someone is giving to you and their date of birth or their social security number or their address, and does this line up? But then there's the authentication. Is it really John Doe who is on the other end of this transaction? And that is often the harder piece of the identity challenge to crack. So important to think about both verification and authentication. But that layered approach really should help to reduce the manual reviews, should help to reduce fraud attempts and fewer false positives, and therefore bring the cost of fraud down.
And, we've sort of seen the numbers in some of the charts, and that's really great. And then one of the things, when designing these workflows, these fraud mitigation workflows, we always encourage to use some of the really low friction checks right up front to get a very, very early, simple understanding of the risks associated with the user, the device, the transaction, and then, where necessary, add the appropriate amount of step-up authentication. And when you have an array of solutions to call on, you can really tailor that experience for your user based on some of the riskiness, based on things you may know about the user. Perhaps they prefer a one-time password to a knowledge-based authentication challenge question. These are the things that we think create really personalized customer experiences without dropping the ball of your fraud mitigation program. And so again, having a dynamic, centralized way to adjust the rigor and the interrogation of each transaction, we think is really showing a lot of success in the market and creating very good customer experiences.
Good point. Let's go to our third recommendation. This is where I was starting before, but we talked about large, but we also have said small and mid-digital lenders are also at risk. And in particular, they should consider additional ways to improve efficiencies and effectiveness of managing fraud. The remote channel, because it is anonymous, tends to be more challenging and therefore more costly for fraud, particularly, again, when we talk about identity fraud. a first step really is to identify and track where fraud is coming from. Is it coming through the mobile channel? Is it coming through the online channel? Is it coming through debit transactions or credit transactions or even paper transactions? Without knowing where one has been successful, where one has been able to prevent fraud, and where fraud has been successful, if you don't look at both points, then you're not looking at all of those attack points that fraudsters are coming in. So without that, it really weakens the ability to plug the holes, so to speak, and really manage that. But tracking is not the only part of the equation here. It alone is not going to lower the fraud volume and the cost. Solutions also have to be at play here because fraud is insidious and it's become more complex, and fraudsters will stop, if they get caught one place, they just move to another, and it's without the help of solutions, it becomes very difficult to stop that. So smaller and mid-digital lenders should consider adopting solutions that are used by the large digital firms. We don't have a chart in here for that. It is in the larger deck. They are using a good number of the identity authentication and transaction verification solutions. There's still optimization that could be had in the way that they layer, but they do set a good lighthouse trend. Together that could really, that is a way to help small and mid lenders navigate this ongoing minefield of fraud. Lucian, anything to add on that?
No, I think understanding your organization's vulnerabilities is sort of critical to knowing which solutions to put in place and in which channels. And so again, just as you judiciously apply scrutiny and add solutions, I think the best place to start is where you are at right now and understanding how agile fraudsters can be. So as they move from one channel to the other, being able to track both the successful and the unsuccessful fraud attempts is going to be crucial when defining that strategy.
So with that said, questions?
We have had some questions roll in from the audience, so we're going to go ahead and take a few of those now. The first question we've got is, we're actually going to go back to slides 8 and 9 for this. Let me go back now. Okay, there we go. How are the numbers for digital firms different than those shown for small, medium, and large digital? So we've got the digital firms count, the second from the left versus the breakouts of the small, mid-digital, and large digital.
Right. Well, first of all, they're averages, and what one would expect is that those averages are going to surround the digital firm. What you see on the small, mid, and the large digital, that together is represented in the digital column, the 277 and the 720. When you pull them apart, the small mid it tends to be lower, and the large digital is higher, and those are averages that surround those. Data does get weighted in terms of the census representation of firms in the universe. So there are more smaller businesses than there are larger. So what you find with averages when you're looking between small and the small, mid, and large is that the averages for the small mid are going to be closer to those of the total than the large. If that answers the question, I'm not sure what else the question was intended to, what the purpose was, or what the question was.
Sure, I believe that covers it, if I understood it correctly as well. What are some of my next question is, what are some of the reasons a consumer would not show up as a result in the LexisNexis database? Is this an immediate indication of fraud?
I'll take this one. And that is certainly indicative of a more risky application, but I would say that that's not necessarily a fraudulent transaction, there are a few different reasons why someone may not show up in a LexisNexis database. And the easiest example is maybe a recent immigrant who just hasn't had a chance to develop and curate a footprint in the public record system and some of the other proprietary databases we source from. We also don't do very much with with younger consumers, and so as they age into becoming into the adult population, we may have very limited information on them. And the thing about the way LexisNexis curates identities, there's a very high level of accuracy and confidence we need to have to be able to show that someone is a active and live consumer. And so if perhaps they only show up on one or two sources, that may not be sufficient for us to show that this is someone we want to put our name as saying that this person is verified.
Perfect. Thanks, Lucian. Our next question is, how do you view the difference between traditional fraud versus bust-out fraud or first-party fraud?
Yeah, I'll take this in a couple different ways. I mean, first-party fraud is really when someone's committing fraud on their own behalf with their own identity. So they were never intending to pay down a loan in the first place. Whereas I think what you think about bust-out fraud, someone actually curates their credit profile and they look after it and sort of pay back loans with the intention that at some point they can build up to a large enough credit where they can then bust out and use sort of all of the credit that they've accumulated over the last months or years. And I'd add another one to that, which is in some ways how a synthetic fraud gets utilized. If you think about, I'll use a little Halloween theme of the way these Frankenstein identities get created, and they sort of stitch together with different PIIs. Because that doesn't belong to any specific consumers, it's very hard for folks to have an action. So very seldom does the consumer report that they've been under any kind of abuse. And for that reason, fraudsters can often use those synthetic IDs and build up a credit history with them before being able to bust out and consume all the credit that they've accumulated over time.
Great. Thank you so much for that. The next question, I'm not sure who wants to take this one, but what do you think is driving the pervasiveness of fraud in online lending?
Well, I certainly have some thoughts. I'll go first, and Chris, you can add to it. I really think it comes down to two things. The first being that there's soft targets and they are emboldened fraudsters. And the soft targets is really around how competitive online lending has become. And this emphasis on growth has caused lenders to move very quickly and to pursue revenue, sometimes at the expense of fraud losses. And so they've become very soft targets for many fraudsters. And the second thing there is really about customer experience. Because they are competing on customer experience, they are looking to introduce as little friction into the application process as possible. You often hear them in their commercials or in their adverts trying to show how quickly you can get to a decision, which has been fantastic for the consumer, but of course that also makes them a softer target, and fraudsters always just go after the easy money. And then this remote and faceless transaction really has emboldened fraudsters, and they feel that they can take a lot more liberty on an online channel, whereas they'd be a lot more cautious when going into a brick-and-mortar store to apply for credit.
Yeah. I'll follow up on Lucian's comments, and I agree with all of them. That is exactly what I would have said. I believe that along with that, we see that synthetic identity fraud is a particular issue among lenders, and that is where a fraudster will take people, whether it's multiple people or it's one person, they will take real personally identifiable information, and then they'll combine that with fake data. So they've created their own identity. And these are professional fraudsters who they know what kind of data they need to get past certain identity verification checks. If they're not rigorous enough, they know what they can provide. And because of the soft targets, this fits right into their alley, because synthetic fraud, those fraudsters will nurture their good credit and their behavior over a longer period of time, getting credit established through the purchase of other services. Then they can bust out, so to speak, to get larger loans and then go bad. And so this is a perfect place for them to really do that.
Great. Thanks, Chris. I've actually got a follow-up question to that, which you may have already touched on here, but just in case there's anything you want to expand on. The question is, why is synthetic identity fraud such a growing threat? Any additional thoughts you want to share?
Yeah, I would just say again, because of the victimless nature of synthetic fraud, it makes a really compelling type of fraud for fraudsters. They can use this for a very long period of time with any consumers actually reporting it as a problem. And I think that's really why we're seeing the growth in synthetic fraud. And quite honestly, there have not been sufficient solutions to combat synthetic fraud. LexisNexis has done a lot of research to identify what a synthetic identity looks like versus a real-life identity. And we've been able to put out studies that show, they don't have driver's license, they don't have the same family and associates, although these are curated, amongst fraud rings potentially, and so they do a good job, but there are certain key indicators that allow us to identify a synthetic identity.
Yeah, and in addition to Lucian's comments, that's exactly spot on. He was talking about the nature of it and the solutions. I think it's true that many solutions out there are not robust enough yet to stop the synthetic identity fraud. And what I mean by that, the solutions that are being used by lenders in the market, there are data gaps that will weaken that ability to match up data with so-and-so. And there are data inaccuracies that make it very hard to determine whether this is an alert or not. So I think it is a combination of the ability of synthetic fraudsters to really stay under the radar because they imitate a good customer, have built up good, they're paying their monthly subscription for something and something, they look good, and it's really hard to detect them and distinguish them from the authentic. That's the scary part about that.
Well, I'll just add one thought recently that I came across was that we are picking up, when we do work for some of our customers, synthetic IDs in collection, which means that this is not even being recognized as a fraud loss. This is being recognized as a credit loss. And so just being able to identify and get enough information on the problem, these lenders perhaps have not put the mitigation process specifically to synthetic IDs in place to actually catch that. And so they sort of playing catch up to some of the fraud being taking place.
Great. Our next question is actually around the number of solutions. We discussed the number of solutions and the impact on their overall losses and management costs and things of that nature. But the question is, 8 solutions seems like a lot. Aren't you concerned that this will impact the customer experience? And what does that do to cost?
Sure. It does sound like a loss. But what I will say is that we are not suggesting that you apply all 8 or 9 solutions every time. The important point to be made here is that the vast majority of cases, very fewer solutions will actually be deployed. And what we are really saying is that only in those cases where risk is being perceived do we need to step up and sort of use some of those additional verification and authentication services. And what we've seen our customers do is to leverage a centralized decisioning platform that can dynamically interrogate those transactions and apply the appropriate amount of solutions and scrutiny for each transaction based on the user, the device. And so again, what sounds like a lot actually turns out not to be the case at all. And of course, it becomes very affordable and very low friction for the vast majority of use cases.
Wonderful. Our next question is actually about reporting synthetic identities. So if a synthetic identity is discovered, how can that be reported to LexisNexis?
Yeah, we actually have a fraud defense network which allows our lenders to contribute suspicious activity, and that would be a prime example of one where you can provide information on activity, devices, addresses, any entity that you believe is being manufactured or to just be of a suspicious nature, and we leverage that in a consortium to help prevent a fraud across the industry.
That is a fantastic tool. Hopefully that helps the person who asked that question. The final question, I know we're just about at time, so I'm going to pose one more question to you all. Do you have recommendations as to when additional solutions would be useful?
I'm assuming that's on the per transaction level. Well, let me maybe not assume that and to say, of course, if you are doing the recommended tracking, it should be pretty visible to see where your vulnerabilities are. And once those vulnerabilities are identified, you can put those additional measures in place. Assuming you're really talking about on the transaction, I would say that what we typically design as a workflow is to do some very low friction assessment at the beginning of an application, so whether that's behavioral biometrics or device assessments, and then to gauge the riskiness of those and combine them with some light identity verification, and at that point be able to decide whether additional step-up authentication solutions need to be introduced. And so that's sort of the point at which we think new solutions need to be brought in.
Perfect. That's really helpful, Lucian. Well, it looks like we are just about time, so we are going to go ahead and wrap up our questions.